successful. Son discovered his mother cleaning bathrooms in his own office. Seeing her on her knees, silently crying, he called the manager, and Baron Smith looked from his office on the top floor of the building. A view that reminded him of how far he had come. He had gone from a childhood in the outskirts with modest dinners and schoolwork under the flickering light of a lamp, to a success that many dreamed of. Now he wore an impeccable suit and drove luxury cars and hosted dinners where he toasted with entrepreneurs and influential figures. Every detail of his life seemed carefully designed to reflect the triumph he had worked tirelessly to get. There, leaving behind a history that in his mind didn't fit this new reality, his mother. Martha was the central figure of that humble past, a woman with weathered hands and a gentle voice who raised him alone and devoted herself to giving him an education. Martha always said her son would go far, but Baron was sure even she couldn't imagine the world he inhabited. Now, of course, Baron and Martha stayed in touch, but it had become a formal, distant relationship. His mother's calls always came at inconvenient times, as if the past were trying to intrude on the polished image of his present. He used to send her money and gifts every month, a check that Martha accepted with a mix of gratitude and resignation. Through Baron didn't know it. He believed that was enough, that those remittances represented his commitment to his family, but they also kept his mother at a distance. Keeping away as a way to protect yourself. He thought his wife, Eva, had been a crucial part of Baron's transformation since he met her. She made it clear that to be part of his world, he needed to refine himself. Eva came from a wealthy family where dinners were held in rooms adorned with silver and pork, and words were always measured and calculated. Her sophisticated beauty-controlled laughter and the confidence with which she handled any situation were part of what attracted Baron so much. But that attraction also brought with it a shift in focus. Eva gently at first and then directly pushed him to let go of his past. "It's better if you're discreet about your history," she said, with an expression suggesting she was doing it for his own good. Thus, the figure of Martha began to fade from Baron's life like a shadow, disappearing into the distance, and the frequency of visits decreased until they were nearly non-existent. When they talked, he told her about his travels and his company's achievements, but he avoided details of his life with Eva. Knowing his mother might sense something he wasn't ready to admit, their conversations became monologues in which Martha only listened, accepting her son's distant feelings in every conversation. The coldness he thought he was hiding well. Baron didn't realize that the more success he accumulated, the further he drifted from Martha and the essence of who he truly was. One afternoon, while reviewing the organization of the gala he would host at his company, his assistant handed him a call from his mother. Martha wanted to know if her son would be in town that weekend. It had been months since she last saw him, and she wanted to invite him to lunch at her modest apartment. Baron hesitated, looking for an excuse, but in the end, he reluctantly accepted committing to it if his schedule allowed. Martha, with the same patience she always had, replied, "I understand. Son, I'll be glad to see you if you can." She hung up without reproach and without a hint of disappointment, though inside the silence of her home reminded her how much she missed her son. Eva, who had overheard part of the conversation, raised an eyebrow and, with a grimace of displeasure, suggested that instead of making visits that complicated his schedule, Baron could send her a gift, a token to show his appreciation. "She'll be fine with something symbolic," she said, her tone making her discomfort evident. Baron, though feeling a slight pang of guilt, accepted the suggestion. It was easier to send her a bouquet and a small present than to spend a day of his weekend in the place where he grew up. Thus, the weekend arrived, and instead of seeing his mother, Baron kept his promise to Eva to accompany her to a charity gala. The event was full of influential figures, and as he mingled from group to group, introducing himself and being introduced, Baron felt he was exactly where he had always dreamed of being. The lights shone brightly, conversations revolved around business and ambitious projects, and the luxury of his surroundings seemed to validate all his decisions. However, at some point during the evening, something broke his concentration. It was a simple thought, a fleeting image of his mother in the kitchen of that small apartment, probably waiting for the doorbell to ring. The image was so vivid it disturbed him, and for a moment, the opulence of the gala seemed superficial. AA noticed and asked him if something was wrong, but he merely smiled, hiding his turmoil. It was easier to maintain his composure than to explain the conflict that, although he didn't want to admit it, was beginning to stir within him that night. Baron returned home with AA, who appeared satisfied with the evening. He, on the other hand, felt empty as he had gained a lot. But he was starting to realize what he had lost in the process, yet he still didn't know how deep that emptiness was, or how far he was willing to go to confront it. The night of the gala at his company arrived, and the Baron was in his element. He wore one of his best suits and moved with a confidence he had cultivated over the years. The evening had been meticulously planned. Guests, from partners and investors to prominent business people, gathered to celebrate the success of his company. The tables were adorned with white flowers and candle holders, emitting a soft light music floated in the air, and toasts sounded amidst laughter and light conversations. It was a night designed to impress, a night where Baron was to be the central figure. AA, as always, was by his side, smiling and charming. Acting as the perfect complement to her husband, their eyes met occasionally, and he felt a superficial satisfaction, convinced he had achieved the ideal he had long pursued. But amidst the toasts and chatter, Baron felt a sudden, annoying urge. He remembered that he had forgotten an important document in his office. Eva noticed his discomfort and quietly asked what was wrong. Baron, with a slight apologetic smile, explained that he needed to retrieve the document quickly. Eva, with a controlled smile, gave him a nod of approval and returned to a conversation with a group of guests. Baron excused himself and headed to the elevator. As he ascended, the noise of the party faded, leaving him in an odd silence upon reaching the office floor. The hallway was dimly lit and wrapped in an almost sepulchral air. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he walked toward his office, the echo of each step making the space feel even emptier. But then something made him stop. From the reflection in a mirror in the hallway, Baron saw a familiar figure crouched near the bathrooms. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but as he approached cautiously, his vision cleared. It was an older woman with a grey hair tied up and slow movements, cleaning the floor in a janitor's uniform. Baron felt something in his chest constrict as he recognized his mother, Martha, who seemed oblivious to his presence. His heart raced, and a mix of disbelief and shame flooded over him as he tried to process what he was seeing. Martha was on the ground, scrubbing hard at a stain that wouldn't come out around her. Cleaning buckets and supplies gave the atmosphere a humble appearance that contrasted painfully with the opulence of the party. Baron felt a pang in his stomach seeing her hands, which he remembered as warm and strong in his childhood. Now worn and rough, barely holding the broom, she struggled to push across the cold floor. Martha paused for a moment, letting out a weary sigh with the back of her hand. She wiped her eyes, allowing the exhaustion and sadness she had carried in silence to seep through for a moment. Baron watched in silence, unable to move. Trapped in the reflection of that image that tormented him, he felt shame, anger, and a deep pain, as if all his success and the decisions he had made were stabbing him. In that instant, he couldn't comprehend how it was possible that his mother, the woman who raised him alone, and who made so many sacrifices for him to get to where he was in his company cleaning bathrooms as if he didn't exist. He wanted to approach her to say something, but something inside him held him back. He felt a repulsion toward himself that he had never experienced. Before, memories of his childhood rushed through his mind like a whirlwind of images of Martha caring for him, her hands holding him with love and protection. Now, those same hands moved slowly over the floor. Nearly broken by the weight of years and effort, Baron felt he couldn't breathe. He was caught between the urge to help her and the paralysis of shame and guilt. Finally, without Martha noticing his presence, Baron stepped back. The footsteps that took him away from his mother echoed with a hollow sound, as if each one sunk him deeper into overwhelming sorrow. He returned to the party pale-faced, and with a distant expression that Eva immediately noticed as he reached her side. She asked if everything was okay, but he merely replied that he felt a bit tired. Struggling to maintain a smile that was hard to hold, Eva dismissed it and returned to chatting with her friends, unaware of the tremor in her husband's hands as the laughter and toasts continued. Baron felt that the luxury and elegance of the celebration turned absurd, almost obscene. Every superficial comment, every pretentious gesture seemed to him an empty echo, a mockery of the image he had seen just moments before in the distance. Eva kept conversing as if nothing had happened, and Baron, observing the coldness with which she ignored any discomfort, felt that everything he had built was a facade. The hours slipped by slowly, and Baron, trapped in his thoughts, couldn't stop reliving the image of his mother on the floor on her knees, cleaning the bathroom of the company he had created for the first time in years. The weight of his success and his comfortable life felt unbearable, as if every achievement and every luxury were tainted by his mother's sacrifices. A sacrifice he had never wanted to face directly that night when the party ended and the lights went out. Baron returned home in oppressive silence. Eva, noticing his quietness, asked him several times what was wrong, but he avoided giving concrete answers. She, frustrated by his behavior, eventually gave up and fell asleep in their marital bed while Baron lay awake. His eyes fixed on the ceiling, he knew that what he had seen would change his life, that he could no longer pretend that his mother's sacrifices were in the past. The image of Martha on her knees in the bathroom haunted him, becoming a constant reminder of the distance he had created himself in that moment. Baron understood that he had to face the truth, but he didn't know how to do it without destroying everything he had built. The memory of that night wouldn't leave Baron. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of his mother on the floor of his company, kneeling and cleaning in silence, assaulted him with unbearable rawness. On the days that followed, he tried to concentrate on his work, but his thoughts always drifted back to the same thing. The tension showed on his face, and his distant behavior began to worry. His employees and his wife Eva, who was starting to lose patience one morning, unable to bear the uncertainty and guilt any longer, Baron decided to investigate Martha's situation. He needed to understand why she was working in his company without his knowledge, and why, despite the money he sent her every month, she seemed trapped in a life of sacrifice and weariness. The thought of Martha, his mother, needing to work at her age consumed him with rage and shame. Shouldn't she be resting, he wondered, trying to convince himself that the situation was only temporary and that he would soon find an explanation. Baron began reviewing the records of temporary employees and discovered his mother's name on a list that included subcontracted workers from the cleaning company covering night shifts. The fact that Mara was on his payroll, but as maintenance staff, was a direct blow to his pride and made him question his own success. As he dug deeper, he realized this was not her only job. His mother worked at other cleaning companies and practically filled her nights every week. The magnitude of her work schedule was exhausting. She barely had time to sleep. Baron's initial surprise and indignation transformed into something deeper and darker as he continued reviewing Martha's bank accounts. Despite the transfers he made, the accounts showed a balance that was almost always at the limit. There were expenses that didn't align with the life he thought his mother led. He noted payments to third parties, loan repayments, interests that seemed to have grown over time. Baron, seeing the pattern of accumulated debt, knew something more was happening. It was then that reality hit him hard. Martha was not just working to survive, she was burdened with considerable debt. Baron felt an indescribable emptiness at the thought that all the money he sent was not enough to relieve her of the burden. He wanted to justify it by thinking that perhaps his mother didn't know how to manage her finances, or that she might have made poor decisions. But as he reviewed the transactions, he noticed something that troubled him even more. Several of the sums sent were intended to cover expenses for his younger brother, Josh. Josh hadn't had direct contact with him for years. Baron vaguely remembered that troubled teenager, always in trouble, who had been a constant headache for their mother while he sought success and distanced himself. Josh had remained behind, stuck in the environment that Baron had tried so hard to escape. But now, seeing those transfers, he realized that his brother had been consuming his mother's life, even from a distance. Determined to get to the bottom of the situation, Baron took a breath and went to visit Martha's apartment. During the journey, his thoughts oscillated between guilt, anger, and concern. He couldn't understand how he had ignored the signs for so long, how he had allowed Martha to live in such precious circumstances. Without even noticing, he was convinced that upon arrival, Martha would try to downplay the situation as she always did to protect him. When he arrived, he rang the bell and waited. Martha opened the door. Surprised but also tired, Baron's eyes scanned the modest apartment. Every piece of furniture and every corner reminded him of his childhood, the warmth he always felt in that home. But now something was different. Everything looked worn, as if reflecting his mother's life marked by time and unceasing effort. Unable to contain his frustration, Baron went straight to the point. "Mom, why are you working at the company? Why do you have so much debt?" he asked bluntly, with a mix of concern and reproach in his voice. Martha, initially taken aback, lowered her gaze. Avoiding the weight of the truth she knew he was seeking with a sigh, Martha tried to reassure him, insisting that her job at the company was just a temporary way to stay active. But Baron, unable to contain his frustration, insisted that she'd be honest. Slowly, Martha's resistance began to crumble, and eventually she started to open up. She explained that, in reality, the situation was much more complicated than he imagined. Baron's father, whom he remembered fondly, had never died in an accident. He had been imprisoned when Baron and Josh were young. The life Baron had always believed in was in fact a story constructed by Martha to protect him and his brother from the stigma the man Baron idealized had fallen into dark dealings and scams. When he was arrested, he left the family in a deep economic crisis, full of debts, and without anyone to rely on. Martha had borne all that a responsibility. She took on the debts, the sacrifices, and the shame in silence, working tirelessly to support her children, even if it meant humiliating herself and hiding the truth. Baron listened in silence, feeling the ground beneath him crumble. The image he had of his father, and even his mother, transformed. Before his eyes, the story he thought was he was collapsing, exposing a pain his mother had carried alone for years. Martha continued, explaining that despite her efforts, Josh had not been able to escape his problem and had followed the same dark path. He too was accumulating debts and was in financial trouble, although Baron sent money monthly. Martha used a good portion of those funds to help her younger son, trying to prevent him from falling into an abyss of no return. "He's my son. Baron, what could I do? I couldn't abandon him," she said, with a mix of sadness and resignation. Baron felt a mix of anger, shame, and deep helplessness. It was as if everything he had built was based on an invisible sacrifice he had never wanted to see. In an attempt to understand, he asked her why she had never told him the truth, why she had allowed him to live in that lie. Martha looked at him with tenderness and told him she always wanted to give him a chance to live without the weight of his father's mistakes that she preferred to see him free from, the burden she had to bear. The chapter concludes with Baron leaving his mother's apartment speechless, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He feels a heartbreaking guilt and confusion, but also a growing anger toward Josh, who, far from helping Martha, seemed to sink her deeper into a cycle of sacrifice and exhaustion. Baron realizes that the family situation is much more complicated than he had imagined, and he feels he must do something to rectify what he has ignored for so long. But the weight of that responsibility overwhelms him and leaves him trapped in a web of emotions. He still doesn't know how to resolve the impact of the truth revealed by his mother. Wouldn't relent for Baron the image of his father, whom he had always idealized as a hard-working and dedicated man, now transformed into that of someone entangled in deception. A man who had betrayed his family's trust. As Baron walked to his car that night, a silent fury took hold of him. Martha's revelations had left him confused and disoriented. Not only had he lost the image of his father, but also his confidence in his own success. Everything seemed to wobble, and guilt consumed him. But above all, his anger was directed at one person, Josh. Josh, his younger brother, had become a stranger in his life, someone Baron barely knew anything about for years. The relationship between them had crumbled at some point during Josh's adolescence, when the paths each had chosen became irreconcilable, while Baron struggled to get ahead to leave behind the stigma of his childhood and build something he could be proud of. Josh seemed to sink deeper into trouble, dragging Martha down in the process. But until now, Baron had never considered the depth of that distance nor the weight it represented for their mother. That same night, Baron locked himself in his office, determined to find Josh and confront him. He could no longer bear the guilt alone, nor could he tolerate the thought of his brother dragging their mother into a life of work and sacrifice that he himself had abandoned years ago. After a few hours of searching and making some calls, Baron got Josh's address. He lived in a rundown neighborhood in a small and neglected building far removed from the world of luxury. Baron had become accustomed to the next day in the late afternoon. Baron headed to the place where the walls of the building were stained and cracked, and the lights flickered in the hallways. Baron could hardly recognize his brother in that environment. The contrast with his own life was so drastic that he felt like an intruder. He climbed the stairs, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and anxiety. As he approached Josh's apartment door, when he knocked, he heard noises from the other side. Josh opened the door reluctantly, and upon seeing Baron, looked at him with a mix of surprise and disdain. "What are you doing here?" he asked, not even bothering to hide the hostility in his voice. Baron held back his rage, took a deep breath, and told him they needed to talk. Josh let him in, slamming the door shut. With a bang that echoed in the small space of the apartment was a reflection of Josh's life, messy with old furniture and scattered objects in every corner. There were empty bottles on the table, and the air was thick with a rancid smell. Baron looked around, feeling a repulsion. He tried to mask, but when he finally looked at his brother, all the resentment he had bottled up exploded. "How can you live like this? Don't you realize what you're doing to Mom?" Baron began, his voice firm but laden with reproach. "Do you know how hard she works to support you? You're taking her life away while you keep sinking into your own problems." Josh looked at him, initially surprised by the harshness of his words, but soon his expression shifted to one of defiance. With a bitter laugh, he stood up and approached Baron, looking him straight in the eye. "And what do you know, Baron? Do you think you can come here and judge me? You left, brother. You abandoned us to live your life of luxury. I'm the one who stayed with her, the one who bore the weight of everything you wanted to forget. You have no right to come here and tell me how to live." Baron felt anger swell within him, but he tried to remember, that doesn't justify what you're doing. Why don't you work? Why do you have to depend on her like a parasite? Mom deserves to rest, not carry you. Josh let out a bitter laugh. "Work? What world are you living in, Baron? Do you think everyone has your opportunities? She always protected you and always treated you like you were special, like you were her great hope. Do you know what it's like to live as the child who was left behind and who has nothing while you went off and forgot about everything?" Baron felt a knot in his throat, but he couldn't allow Josh to place all the blame on him. "I worked hard to get ahead, Josh. None of this was easy for me either, really," Josh replied sarcastically from where I was standing. "It seems you've had everything you wanted. Mom has spent her life sacrificing for you while I tried to survive. Now you come here as if you were the hero, like you could fix everything. You know nothing about what I've had to endure." At that moment, Baron realized how deep Josh's resentment ran to him. Baron wasn't a brother, but someone who had had the privilege of escaping, of seeking his own path, while the family remained behind. Josh blamed him not only for leaving, but for the fact that Baron had achieved what he could never attain. "This isn't about me, Josh," Baron said in a soft yet firm tone. "It's about Mom. She's exhausted. She can't keep working like this. If you want things to change, you need to take responsibility. She shouldn't have to keep cleaning bathrooms to pay for your mistakes." Josh looked at him, but this time his expression had changed. Instead of defiance, his face reflected a mix of anger and pain. "Do you think I don't know? Do you think I don't see how she's fading away? But you've never been here. You don't know what it's like for her when you're not around, when you're the son who made it, and I'm the one who only brings problems." Baron felt that Josh's words cut deep, but the tension in the air was still palpable. There was a painful truth in Josh's words, something he couldn't deny. "You may be right, Josh. I may not have been here. I may not have seen what was happening, but now I'm here, and I want to fix this. Help me do it." Josh stared at Baron for a few seconds, a pause that felt infinite, as if he were assessing his brother's intentions, but instead of accepting his proposal, his face hardened again. "I don't need your help. I don't need you coming here to redeem yourself as if you could save everyone. Leave, Baron. Go back to your perfect life." Baron tried to reason with him, but it was futile. Josh wasn't ready to accept his help, nor acknowledge his role in their mother's sacrifice. With an unbearable weight on his chest, Baron left the apartment, aware that his brother was trapped in a spiral of resentment and self-destruction that he probably didn't want to escape as. He walked to his car. Baron felt a profound desolation. His family was more broken than he had imagined, and he, with his success and achievements, had become a stranger to them. Guilt and helplessness mingled within him, and he understood that the distance he had built not only separated him from his roots, but had also created an abyss that was now difficult to bridge with the weight of that truth. Baron realized that although his brother was unwilling to change, he could not give up. He had to find a way to free his mother from that burden, to somehow help her regain the peace and dignity she so deserved. The confrontation with Josh left Baron emotionally drained. Guilt, shame, and helplessness mixed to form a knot inside him that he couldn't untangle. He had spent the last few nights awake, trying to find a way out of a way to help his mother without depending on Josh, who was clearly not ready to take responsibility, however. Baron knew that for Martha, her other son remained a priority, complicating the situation even furthermore. As Baron tried to cope with his family conflict, another shadow loomed over him from within his own company. Jacob, his trusted manager, had been watching him closely for some time, studying each of his moves. Jacob was a shrewd and ambitious man, and he had noticed the changes in Baron. Since that night of the gala, he saw the distraction in his eyes, the exhaustion that hadn't been there before, and began to perceive a vulnerability Baron had successfully hidden. Until then, with the calculating coldness of someone who knows how to manipulate the weaknesses of others, Jacob began to discreetly investigate. He discovered Baron's relationship with Martha, and quickly realized that she was not just a cleaning employee, but the mother of the company's owner. With this information in hand, Jacob began to devise a plan. He knew Baron was distracted and emotionally unstable, and decided to take advantage of that to consolidate his position and, if all went well, gain more control within the company. Jacob started by approaching Martha in the hallways. At first, subtly shows kindness by asking her about her well-being and offering occasional help. Martha was puzzled by the attention, appreciated the gestures, but preferred to keep her distance. However, Jacob began to become more insistent, and soon the helps transformed into suggestions laden with pressure. It would be convenient for you to take more shifts. Mrs. Smith, you know the company always needs committed people, Jacob would say with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Martha felt the pressure, accepted the additional shifts. She was caught between her need to work to cover the debts and the fear that if she refused, she might lose her job, and with it the little stability she had managed to maintain. As the days went by, Jacob increased the pressure on Martha. He began to hint that if she didn't take the shifts he assigned, there could be consequences. We don't want anyone to think you're getting special treatment just for being Baron's mother, he once said in a tone that left little room for interpretation. Martha, despite her exhaustion, accepted the extra hours, silently enduring Jacob's insinuations and demands. She couldn't afford to lose her job or risk jeopardizing her son's reputation. Meanwhile, Baron, unaware of what Jacob was doing in the shadows, continued trying to focus on work, although his mind kept returning again and again to his mother and Josh. The company that had always been his refuge now felt like an oppressive place, a constant reminder of the sacrifices his mother had made so he could build that empire. His meetings, his projects all felt empty and meaningless. Jacob, aware that Baron was more distracted than ever, began making decisions within the company without consulting him. He called meetings with partners, modified contracts, and took risky initiatives, all in an effort to gain power and solidify his position. Employees began to notice Jacob's growing influence, but no one dared to question him. After all, he always presented himself as Baron's right-hand man. One day, Jacob dared to take a further step. He summoned Martha to a secluded break room away from the cameras and the constant flow of employees. The woman, somewhat uneasy, accepted the invitation, thinking it would just be another meeting to coordinate her schedule. However, when she entered the room and saw Jacob's expression, she understood that something was wrong. Martha, I think we need to talk seriously, Jacob said with a tone of false cordiality. He settled into the chair across from her, clasping his hands on the table, staring intently at her. You know it's difficult for someone in your position to understand the impact certain rumors can have on a company of this magnitude. Martha looked at him confused. What are you talking about, Mr. Jacob? He smiled, but a spark of threat shone in his eyes. I'm talking about your son's reputation. Martha, Baron has worked hard to build this company, and you, as his mother, should understand how important it is to protect it. Martha felt a shiver run down her spine. Jacob continued, You see, I've heard certain comments people make. You know how it is. Some employees have started asking why someone like you works here in our company when clearly your son could provide you with a better life." Martha clenched her hands, trying to control the trembling that gripped her. She knew Jacob's insinuation was clear, but she had no other option. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Jacob. I don't want any trouble, of course not, Martha." Jacob set his tone now, sharper. "But there are ways to avoid trouble, don't you? Think, for example, you could take on a few extra shifts, and if there's anything you need to discuss, you can come directly to me without involving Baron." Jacob's words fell like a net, ensnaring. Martha understood that if she wanted to keep her job and prevent Baron from being affected, she would have to submit to Jacob's conditions. She silently agreed, feeling her dignity crumbled a little more with each extra shift, with each veiled threat. Jacob threw her way, always accompanied by a smile that made her blood boil day after day. Jacob increased the burden on Martha, assigning her more tasks and demanding she work extra hours without compensation. She was exhausted and scared, accepted in silence, fearing that her son would be harmed if she spoke up. She knew Jacob was manipulating her fear and her need to protect Baron, but she saw no other way. The pressure mounted, and her strength began to wane. Meanwhile, Baron remained immersed in his internal struggle, unaware that the true danger lay not with his brother, but within his own company, with the man he considered his trusted ally. Jacob's manipulation advanced stealthily, and more employees began to see him as the true power. Behind Baron's success, unbeknownst to Baron, his company, his life, and his mother's dignity were being eroded by someone without scruples, someone who wouldn't hesitate to oppress and humiliate Martha to satisfy his own ambition. Baron had yet to realize that his greatest enemy was not the dark past of his family, but the betrayal of someone who had been by his side in the shadows, waiting for the opportune moment to seize control. Baron had been submerged in a fog of distraction and anguish. For weeks, his thoughts continually returned to Martha and Josh, and each day it became harder to focus on his work. The image of his mother, exhausted and subjected to a job she didn't deserve, tormented him day and night. He had tried to alleviate his guilt by increasing bank transfers and sending her some gifts, but he knew that didn't address the underlying problem of his relationship with Eva was also beginning to deteriorate as Baron withdrew into his thoughts. Eva became increasingly frustrated, and her reproach grew more frequent and sharp. She scolded him that his distraction was affecting their social life, and that if he continued this way, the company's important partners would lose confidence in him. Baron tried to mask his exhaustion, but it became harder and harder. He felt trapped in a situation that seemed to have no way out, caught between the public life of success and the reality of his family, which was gradually crumbling. Meanwhile, Jacob continued to advance his plan with Martha under his control. She worked longer hours and took on more tasks, often without pay. Jacob constantly threatened her, saying her job situation was delicate and that any misstep could jeopardize her position. Furthermore, Jacob had begun making significant decisions within the company, manipulating contracts and pressuring key employees to win their loyalty. Baron's distraction gave Jacob free rein to act as he wishes, and no one in the company dared to question him. One day, Jacob decided it was time to execute the final blow. He knew Baron was emotionally vulnerable and that a public scandal could completely destabilize him. For Jacob, this was the perfect opportunity to consolidate his position and weaken Baron in the eyes of partners and investors. With all the information he had gathered about Martha, Josh, and the dark past of Baron's family, Jacob prepared to launch a campaign that would irreparably destroy Baron's reputation with calculated precision. Jacob summoned a few journalists. He knew he leaked information about Baron's father, detailing his criminal background and fraudulent activities. He exaggerated every detail, insinuating that Martha had been involved in her husband's shady dealings, and that even now she might be hiding dark secrets. He suggested that Baron had used the company to launder his family's reputation and conceal the criminal past that haunted him. Jacob knew that the rumors and insinuations would be enough to tarnish Baron's reputation, and he was willing to exploit every bit of information to let the scandal explode. The next day's headlines in newspapers and online news were filled with stories about the Smith family. They spoke of an empire built on lies and a company tainted by a criminal past. Social media erupted with comments and speculation, and the press wasted no time in investigating the darkest details of the story. Barron, arriving at the office that morning, was met with distrustful glances and whispers he didn't understand what was happening until one of his employees showed him the news. The impact was devastating. Barron felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. All his work, everything he had built, was being destroyed in a matter of hours. The reputation of his company, which had been his pride and symbol of success, was now tarnished, and his future hung by a thread. The betrayal of his own father and the sacrifice of his mother were now a public scandal, something everyone looked at with morbid curiosity and disdain. The company's partners reacted immediately. Several meetings were cancelled, and some investors withdrew their support. Barron tried to explain the situation, but he found himself in the middle of a storm of speculation and accusations that he could hardly defend. Against every word he spoke were reinterpreted in news headlines, and the accusations only intensified in the midst of the chaos. Barron sought support from AA, who at first offered superficial comfort, but when the magnitude of the scandal became evident, her attitude changed. She was unable to tolerate the impact the scandal would have on her own image, began to show her true colors. She demanded that Barron make a decision, to cut all ties with his mother and brother or risk losing the little social support he still had. "This is unsustainable, Barron. Your mother, your brother, your entire family is an embarrassment," Eva said, her tone cold and full of contempt. "If you want to save what's left of our reputation, you have to leave all this behind. You can't let your family's mistakes destroy what we've built." Barron looked at her, surprised and hurt. There was no trace of love or support in her words. He suddenly realized that Eva had never really been by his side for who he was, but for what he represented in terms of power and status. The perfect facade they had built together was just that, an empty facade. And now, when the storm hit, her was not willing to stay and face it together. "Are you really asking me to abandon my family?" he replied, a mix of disbelief and sadness. But Eva didn't hesitate, for her own social standing and reputation were more important than Barron's family or his mother's sacrifice. Without saying another word, Barron understood that his relationship with Eva had irrevocably broken that same night. Barron returned home alone without the support of his wife or the partners who had once considered him an ally. The situation devastated him, but a new determination began to rise within him. He knew he could no longer live a lie or hide the truth about his family. Everything he had ignored and left in the shadows had come to light in the most painful way. But perhaps he thought this was the moment to face it with courage. The next day, Barron called a press conference. Journalists crowded in, expecting a spectacle, a confession, or an excuse. With a serious and calm expression, Barron took the microphone, and instead of denying everything, he began to tell the story of his family. He had decided that he would hide nothing more, and that he would accept his truth regardless of the consequences. He spoke of his mother's, the sacrifice of the years, of silent labor and the debts she had to take on. He explained how Martha had hidden the truth about his father, bearing an impossible burden to protect her children. He acknowledged his own mistakes, the time he had distanced himself from the coldness with which he had treated his mother, and took the blame for ignoring what she was going through. He publicly declared that he was proud of Martha for her strength and courage, and that he would never turn his back on her, no matter what others thought. Barron's sincerity surprised everyone. There were no attempts at justification or empty words. It was a painful and honest confession, an exposure that moved many of those present, although the scandal still loomed over him. His act of bravery and respect for his mother began to change public perception. Some began to see in him a man who, although he had made mistakes, was willing to face them with dignity. After the press conference, Barron's situation remained uncertain. Many partners still distrusted him, and his company was in deep crisis. But amidst the ruin, Barron experienced an unexpected peace for the first time in years. He didn't feel the weight of appearances or the pressure to live up to others' expectations. His life, though engulfed in chaos, was now more real and sincere than it had been a long time. Over time, some partners began to return, drawn by the authenticity Baron had demonstrated. Although his company had lost much, he understood that he now had the opportunity to rebuild it from a more honest foundation. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he had the strength and resilience he had learned from his mother, the same strength that had silently supported him all these years, with a renewed determination and a rekindled connection with his family. Baron understood that his life would no longer be marked by superficial success, but by the value of truth and the respect he now felt for those who had sacrificed everything for him. Baron had left the press conference. Feeling exhausted but strangely relieved for the first time in years, he had told the truth about his family and his mother's sacrifice, although the scandal had not dissipated and his company's situation remained fragile. The sincerity and respect with which he spoke seemed to have touched many of the press, while still watching him closely began to change the tone of their coverage. Shifting from criticism to astonishment at his bravery, however, the pain and guilt still weighed heavily on him. Baron knew he had faced part of his story, but many wounds remained open, especially with Martha. He hadn't spoken to his mother since the scandal broke, and while she knew part of the truth, he still owed her a deep conversation. He needed to see her, confront her, and express how he truly felt. He knew he couldn't repair all the years of indifference and distance in one talk, but he also knew he had to try that afternoon. He decided to visit Martha unexpectedly. He walked through the streets of his neighborhood, feeling once again like the young man who had grown up there before. With ambition and thirst for success had separated him from his roots, when he arrived, he knocked on the door and waited. Martha opened it, and upon seeing him, there showed a faint surprise, a mix of relief and worry in her eyes. "Hi," Mom, Baron said, his voice soft but laden with emotion. Martha looked at him for a moment, as if trying to read in his face that he couldn't express in words. "Hello, son, please come in," Martha replied, gesturing for him to enter. They settled into the small living room silent, both feeling the weight of the words they wanted to say but unsure where to start. Finally, Baron took a breath and spoke. "Mom, I want to apologize for the years I distanced myself, for thinking that sending money and gifts was enough, for not seeing the sacrifice you made all this time. I thought I was doing the right thing by distancing myself. I was protecting you, but I was just being selfish." Martha looked at him with sad but understanding eyes. "Baron, I understand. I also wanted to protect you, to hide the truth, so you wouldn't have to carry the weight of our past. Maybe I was wrong to hide so much from you, to let you believe that your father was a man he wasn't. But everything I did was for you and for Josh, so that you could have a chance to live freely." Baron felt his eyes welling with tears. "Mom, you should have never had to carry all that alone. I had no idea how much you endured, how hard it had been. I distanced myself to build my life, thinking I was doing what was best. But I forgot about you and Josh. He was part of that too. I haven't been a good brother either." Martha sighed, and for the first time her eyes reflected a deep sadness she had held for years. "Josh is different, Baron. He has lived a difficult life, and in a way, I think he has always felt that you were the son who managed to escape while he stayed here trapped in the past. Each of you sought a way to survive in your own way, and sometimes resentment grows in heart that can't find peace." Baron nodded, understanding. Perhaps for the first time, the magnitude of the resentment Josh felt. "I know I've made mistakes with him too, and I can't fix everything overnight. But I want to do something. I want this all to mean something. If I've learned anything from this situation, it's that even though I tried to distance myself, our lives are intertwined. I can't ignore that." Martha, with a sweet look, took Baron's hands. "What matters, son, is that you understand it now. Life gives you opportunities to change, and while the past can't be erased, you can write a different future. But don't do this just out of guilt. Do it because now you know what truly matters." Martha's words filled Baron with clarity. He knew that his company, while it had been his greatest achievement, no longer represented everything he was. He needed to do something meaningful, not just for himself, but for his family, and for people like Martha, who spent their lives in invisible, exhausting jobs. He expressed to his mother his desire to help her and to change the way people like her were treated in the labor market. Martha, surprised and excited, nodded, seeing in him a renewed determination with a clear idea in mind. Baron began working on a project that would transcend his company. he decided to found an organization dedicated to improving the working conditions of cleaning workers, a job he had long despised or ignored. Together with Martha and her friend Clara, who had also spent years working in cleaning, they started to outline the initial plans. Martha, though initially doubtful that the effort would have an impact, I began to get involved, knowing this was an opportunity to do something for those who, like her, had worked silently and without recognition. Slowly, Baron began to reach out to his brother Josh. Their relationship remained tense, and their meetings were uncomfortable, laden with resentment, but Baron did not give up. He knew that Josh needed time and patience to heal his wounds, and it wouldn't be easy to earn his trust with each conversation. Josh displayed a firm resistance, but he also began to see the change in his brother and the sincere effort he was putting into rebuilding the bond they had lost. One day, Josh joined Baron in the organization. His role was small at first, but little by little, he became involved in support programs for at-risk youth, sharing his story and helping them find alternatives to the dark paths he himself had walked, though it was difficult for him to admit at first. Josh began to feel part of something, and that sense of belonging, that feeling of purpose, started to alleviate some of his resentment. The organization grew rapidly and caught the attention of media and activists who began to recognize Baron's transformation, his story of redemption, and the work he was doing with his mother and brother inspired many. And soon, several workers and unions joined the project. Baron and Martha were invited to speak at events, and their story of sacrifice, reconciliation, and commitment to labor justice began to resonate in society. At one of these presentations, Martha spoke publicly for the first time about her life, about the years she had spent in silence and the struggles she had endured to give her children a dignified life. She moved everyone with her sincere words and quiet dignity, and at the end, she received an ovation that deeply moved her. Baron, watching her from the audience, felt immense pride, finally understanding the strength and sacrifice of his mother. The reconciliation of the Smith family was a slow and painful process, but over time, Baron, Martha, and Josh found a new way to live and support each other. Now, their story was no longer a shameful secret, but a story of struggle and redemption that they shared with others, hoping that their experience could inspire those facing similar situations. For Baron's true success was no longer about numbers or prestige, but about the positive impact he could leave on the world. The company that had once been his pride was now a tool to dignify the work of others. The image of success he had chased so hard had transformed into a life filled with purpose and meaning as Baron worked on his organization and continued to rebuild his relationship with his family. He understood that the path he had traveled, though filled with mistakes, had led him to a place where he could finally be at peace with himself and honor his mother, who had always been his true support and greatest inspiration. The charitable project that Baron had founded alongside Martha and Clara, his mother's friend, was beginning to grow unexpectedly. From what had started as a small effort to dignify cleaning work and offer better labor conditions was turning into a movement that was capturing the attention of more and more people. Baron saw how his life was gaining new meaning, far from the appearances and superficial luxury that had marked his past. Now every achievement of the foundation was a shared victory with his mother, with Joe, and with all those who had once worked in silence, like Martha, who at first doubted that the project could really change the lives of cleaning workers, had started to get more and more involved. Her humility and generous nature made her an essential figure for the employees and their families, who saw in her a woman who understood their struggles. Martha shared her own experiences with other workers, and her story of sacrifice inspired many to join the cause, to fight for better conditions, and to advocate for the respect and dignity they deserved. Her presence was the heart of the organization, and her strength and patience gave her the credibility and charisma that Baron admired deeply for his part. Josh, although reluctant at first, had also begun to find in the organization a purpose to redeem his own mistakes. He joined the support team for at-risk youth, helping them avoid the paths he had walked himself. Josh had never imagined he could do something that would help others, and that responsibility began to transform the way he saw himself. Working on the project alongside Baron confronted him with his own resentments, but it also allowed him to see in his brother a different figure, not the distant and successful man he had despised for so long, but a human being with his own struggles and guilt, someone who was also seeking redemption one day, while Baron was reviewing some documents in his office at the foundation. Josh approached and sat down across from him silently. Baron looked up, surprised by the gesture, as Josh had always preferred to keep his distance even within the organization after a few moments. Josh broke the silence. "I always thought this life was just for you," Josh confessed in his voice, tense but sincere, that everything good that happened to our family was just for you, and that I could never have something worthwhile, but now I feel like maybe I can do something important too. Baron looked at him and moved. "Josh, you also have the right to build something for yourself. This project isn't just mine or Mom's, it's for all of us. And we're all here to heal and give our best." Josh nodded, and for the first time, Baron felt that his brother was willing to let go of the resentment that had separated them for so long. It was a silent moment, but one filled with meaning. The path to reconciliation remained difficult, but Baron knew they were both moving in the right direction. The foundation began to attract the attention of media and activists who admired Baron's transformation and the mission of his organization over the months. They managed to gather support from unions and workers' groups that saw in their project an opportunity to improve labor conditions in the cleaning sector. Baron and Martha were invited to various events, and at each one, Martha spoke from her experience, sharing her story with an authenticity that moved everyone present. At one of these events, a journalist approached Martha after her speech and asked her to share advice for working women who, like her, had spent years sacrificing in silence for their children. Martha smiled, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and humility. "The most important thing is never to forget that our work has value. It may not be visible to everyone, but each of us holds a piece of this world. We deserve respect. And it is our right to fight for a dignified life. Never let anyone make you feel like you are less." Her words were met with an emotional applause, and Baron, watching her from a corner, felt immense. Prid, his mother, who had always lived in the shadows, were now inspiring others, giving them the strength and courage she had discovered in her own journey. The foundation, in addition to improving labor conditions, began offering training programs for workers and their families, as well as scholarships for the children of employees who wished to study. Baron saw each project as a way to give back something of what he had received in his life, knowing that all his success had been possible thanks to his mother's sacrifice and the dreams she had never fulfilled now. By supporting other families, he felt he was honoring Martha's story and giving others the opportunity he himself had had. Over time, the story of the foundation began to transcend borders, and some companies expressed interest in collaborating, adopting more inclusive and fair labor policies inspired by Baron's organization's model. Although the original company was still recovering, Baron understood that true success lay in this new project, in the possibility of transforming lives and building a legacy based on dignity and respect for AA, who had been absent since the scandal broke. Tried to reconnect with Baron when she saw that his public reputation was beginning to improve. However, Barrow, with a clarity he had not possessed before, politely but firmly rejected her. He knew that true love should not depend on appearances or status, and he was no longer willing to sacrifice his values or hide his story to meet someone else's expectations. Every step he took alongside his mother and brother filled him with a peace he had never experienced in his previous life. For the first time, he felt he was building something real and lasting, something that transcended his own success. The emptiness that had pursued him for so long was being filled with purpose and satisfaction as he saw how his project benefited others. Baron and Martha, along with Clara and Josh, continued to work tirelessly on the foundation. In every meeting and every conversation with the workers, they saw reflections of their own struggles, their own sacrifices now. However, their lives had a new meaning, one they shared with everyone around them. The bond between Baron and his mother was once fragile and distant, had strengthened into an unbreakable tie, forged from understanding and respect for Martha. Watching her children begin to heal their wounds, felt a peace she had never experienced. She knew her story had not been in vain, that her effort and love were now part of something that would bring hope to others over time. The foundation became a model for other companies and organizations wishing to dignify their workers. Baron, although he had lost the position he once held, had found a peace and clarity he had never known before. He had gone from being a successful businessman to a man committed to a greater cause, someone who understood the true value of a life dedicated to others. Josh on his path to redemption and continued to help at-risk youth and found a vocation in it. His resentments were dissipating, and each day he found more reasons to move forward and make amends for his mistakes. Barron saw in his brother a renewed strength and determination, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that his family was whole. For Barron's true success was no longer about luxury or social standing, but about the ability to transform the world to offer a better life to those who, like his mother, had been invisible for so long. That he had found in the foundation and his family the purpose and meaning he had long sought. Time had passed, and Barron's life had changed irrevocably. The foundation he had created with Martha and Clara continued to grow, becoming a symbol of justice and labor dignity. What had once been a small effort was now reaching a much larger scope. And the stories of workers who found support, training, and respect in his organization testified to the real impact of their mission. Barron felt that he had finally found a cause worth fighting for, something that honored his mother's sacrifice and gave him a purpose that went far beyond prestige and money. Martha, for her part, had found in the foundation a place where everything she had lived made sense now, far from the forced humility of her circumstance. So she could work for the dignity of others without carrying the burden of silence. Her story, once a secret she hid in sham, had become a beacon of hope for many who, like she, had given their lives in difficult, unrecognized jobs. Martha had never imagined she would be seen as a figure of respect, someone others looked at with admiration. For the peace she found in the Foundation's mission was something she had never thought possible. One day, Barron decided to take a break from the work routine and suggested to Martha that they return to the park, where they used to walk when he was a child. That place hadn't changed much, and upon arrival, Barron felt transported to another time, to those days when he ran around while his mother watched him patiently, unaware of all that she faced to give him a better life. They both sat on a bench, and Barron looked at his mother, seeing in her not just the woman who had raised him, but a silent warrior, someone who had endured years of hardships to give her children a chance. Martha watched the park and smiled as she recalled the moments they had shared there when he was little, and the world seemed less complicated. "Mom, I've never told you this enough, but thank you. Everything I am is because of you," Barron said, his voice trembling. Martha looked at him, her eyes filled with tenderness. "Son, everything I did out of love. Seeing my children thrive has always been my greatest pride, even in the hardest moments. You don't have to thank me. You are the reason I fought." Barron felt a lump in his throat. He remembered with a mix of sadness and gratitude the sacrifice his mother made, the nights of work and the exhaustion she endured in silence. "I spent years trying to prove something to others when the only person I want to make proud is you." Martha took his hand and smiled. "And you have, Barron. You've learned to value what truly matters, and that's something I am more than proud of." The peace of that afternoon and his mother's words gave Barron the certainty that although he had made mistakes, he was on the right path. The shared silences between them were filled with understanding and a love that needed no explanations. Barron understood that true success, the kind that transcended money and fame, lay in that moment of peace, in that renewed connection with his mother and with his own values. As they returned to the Foundation, Barron felt revitalized. In the following months, the organization continued to expand, attracting people who shared his vision and desire for labor. Justice Josh, now increasingly committed, assumed a key role in the Foundation, helping at-risk youth and dedicating his time to preventing others from taking the dark paths he had once walked. For Josh, the Foundation was not just a project, it was the redemption he had long needed. Over time, Barron received proposals from various companies and organizations that wanted to collaborate or replicate the model of his foundation. He accepted some of them, but always remained true to his original mission to dignify workers and provide them with a better life. Barron knew that each step he took was a tribute to Martha's sacrifice, to the years his mother had silently endured. So much for the Smith family. Life had changed irreversibly. Although money and prestige were not as abundant as before, each family member had found a purpose and a peace they would not trade for anything. Martha, seeing her children united and committed, she felt a happiness and tranquility she had not experienced in decades. She knew that while the road had been tough, and every sacrifice had been worth it finally, Baron understood that his family's true legacy was not in luxury or appearances, but in the strength, sacrifice, and resilience that his mother had demonstrated. Now that Josh and Martha shared a bond based on understanding and mutual respect, a connection that had united them in the face of adversity at foundation events, Baron and Martha began to be recognized as a symbol of struggle and dignity. People saw them as a family that, despite difficulties and past mistakes, had managed to find a way to reconcile and build something positive for others. The Smith story ceased to be a shameful secret and became an inspiration for many. The final image of the story shows Baron and Martha sitting in a small auditorium, watching Josh give a talk to a group of young people. Josh spoke candidly about his mistakes, his difficult life, and his transformation, encouraging others to take different paths. Martha watched her two sons with tears in her eyes, feeling immensely proud of them and the journey they had taken together. Baron's life was no longer marked by fleeting success, but by the legacy he had built alongside his mother and brother, a legacy based on dignity, sacrifice, and redemption. He knew that ultimately his success was not in material achievements, but in the positive impact his family had left on the lives of others. They had found the peace they had sought for so long, and that peace was the true triumph of the legacy that would endure beyond them. And so we conclude this story of sacrifice, redemption, and, above all, of love and dignity. We have seen how Baron, Martha, and Josh have traveled a path full of mistakes, but also of courage to face their secrets, to find what truly matters in life. If this story touched you, if it made you reflect on your own connections, your struggles, or the value of the people around you, don't forget to subscribe and leave your comments. We want to hear your experiences and reflections, because all of us, in one way or another, carry stories of sacrifice and redemption. Remember, sometimes true success lies not in what we achieve, but in how we care for our own, in how we value the sacrifices of those who have silently supported us so that we can shine. So until next time, keep building a legacy worth remembering, and, above all, never forget the power of love and dignity in every step you take. See you in the next chapter. Thank you for joining us in this story.